Hello and welcome to Making Art on Air, the official podcast of the Art Academy of Cincinnati. I'm your host, Morgan Grace. Today on the program, we're going to talk to Damian Hoskins. Damian is Executive Director at Elementz, a hip-hop cultural arts center. He's also newly appointed to the Board of Directors at the Art Academy of Cincinnati. And we're going to talk about hip-hop and related things. Ladies and gentlemen, Damian Hoskins. Hello,
Thank
how
you.
are you?
I am fine. Morgan, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
What made you want to get involved with the growth and direction of the Art Academy as a board member?
I actually attended the Art Academy and got my master's degree from the Art Academy in '07. And I am also a product of Cincinnati Public Schools. I graduated from the School for Creative and Performing Arts in 1991, so I'm really old. But from there, I went to Central State University. But then when I got, it's an interesting story. So at Central State, I majored in art my very first year. But then going into my sophomore year, I had a guidance counselor help me with my schedule for the upcoming school year, and she dissuaded me from being an artist. She told me that I would have more luck in the field of education. She used the phrase, "I would be a big fish in a small pond if I changed my major." And what's interesting about that is, as a young African American male, I took that to heart. I wanted obviously to have a successful career path. Wanted to make my parents and my family proud, and if education was the path that I should, that would be the I guess the surest way to make that happen. I considered it very heavily. Then I changed my major. I've been an artist since I was four, however. My dad's a painter, and I got all of my artistic abilities and perspectives from him. But I changed my major, and after changing my major, I got my degree in education, English education, as a matter of fact, and taught middle school English for 13 years. But in the midst of all of that, I began to slowly regret, not following those earlier on proclivities of being an artist. So I had to figure out how to reset that. And what was fortunate is that, life is complicated, so it wasn't an easy disconnect. But I actually began to love teaching, and love my students and things of that nature. But I also know that there was this inner yearning to enter back into the arts in some way. So, I got this is actually back when the Art Academy was on the art museum campus. So it was my first pass at it. So I actually enrolled, and then at the end of that year, I had some family life issues that I had to address, and so I had to take a break. And then the Art Academy moved to 12th and Jackson.
Mm.
And then in that move, I said, okay, now I really I gotta go for it. And so I enrolled in the Art Academy for my Master's of Arts in Education program. Met some wonderful folks. Keith Benjamin was the chair of the Art Academy MAAE program at the time. Wonderful sculptor, wonderful instructor. And so, that sort of rekindled, or actually not rekindled, it actually ignited something in my mind about my relationship with the Art Academy. And once I graduated in '07, I was always trying to figure out a way to be supportive of it because it was my alma mater, right? So it's that sort of connection, because it actually it opened up, a of thinking that had gone dormant a bit, prior to me actually, enrolling. about how to approach art, how to really engage in art as an artist, as a patron, as someone in the arts ecosystem, as a producer. And so and because of that, I wanted to make sure that I sort of gave back to the Art Academy in a meaningful way. And so this was, I mean, that was '07, so that's several years ago when I graduated. And so I've been connected in one way or another. I was a part of the interviewing team for Joe, the current Art Academy president,
Mm.
a few years back, and just began to talk to some board members who were there at the time. Tyson Betts being one of them is a really wonderful person. He's an executive at Procter and Gamble and a board member, been a board member of the Art Academy for some years. And I love his perspective. I truly value his perspective, and so there was just this opportunity. I began to have a stronger relationship with Joe. And we began to talk about collaborations between the Art Academy and Elementz. And then he made this recommendation that I, sit on the board. And I was all for it, just because what the Art Academy did for me. I also was very, very hopeful and trusting, rightfully so, that the Art Academy was doing that for other minority students. And I wanted to be a part of that process and sort of building out the diversity of the student population, and then just continuing the work of the school. The school is really a value add to Cincinnati, and I want to make sure that I'm a part of moving that agenda forward.
What is your art like?
I'm a painter, and then actually, my dad, he's a figurative painter, and so all of my artistic sensibilities came from that. So I'm a figurative painter. I began to sort of stretch that a bit at the Art Academy, at the advice of some of my professors, just to really sort of go out of the realm of sort of traditional figurative painting. Like I would, I'm a fan of Jean Leon Jerome and Kehinde Wiley. These are guys who like really are keen on aesthetics, the human form, and being as accurate as possible, but then also sort of trying to have some kind of commentary, be it social commentary or some kind of commentary in their work, some kind of political commentary, particularly Kehinde Wiley. And from a contemporary standpoint, I wasn't trying to mimic that as much as I was trying to be inspired by that. And so my work is figurative in that regard, but then also I'll end up, because I'm an English teacher, I'll end up putting, pieces or excerpts of poems that I've written in some of my work, and having that be like, embedded in some of it and having that be a part of the focal point of some of the things that I produce, but mostly figurative work with a hint of some literary connections.
Wow, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Were you involved in the music scene at all in Cincinnati?
I am not at all a musician. So, I at SCP, I played the cello for like 6 years, but this was like in my elementary time, and I'm not a musician. I'm a lover of hip hop culture.
Mm.
And so what got me at Elementz is, my love for hip hop culture. Hip hop has actually been the soundtrack of my life. It's the aesthetic of my life. So hip hop was actually born or created in 1973, August 11th of 1973 is the year I was born. So a few months after hip hop was born, I was born. And then, I can just remember growing up and my family, my mom and my aunts, my grandma, my uncles, and my dad, they would have these records, and I would listen to all these records with all this lush, soulful sounds, and then roughly around 1979, I heard an album called "Rapper's Delight"
Mm.
by a group called the Sugar Hill Gang, and it on the song itself was the rapping was over a sample of a Chic song called "Good Times," which is a disco song, which my father had the album. And so I remember like hearing these two things come together. And I thought to myself, this is nothing like I've ever heard before. Um, so I really got, really interested in it. You go outside and you hear everybody like trying to memorize all the words to this song that they just heard on the radio. And I come from a time period where, obviously there was no streaming, there was no Spotify or Pandora or anything like that. It was you listen to the radio, you put a cassette tape in, and you try to record the song, you try to time it perfectly so you can record the song. And so, that became like really, really inspirational. And then hip hop, just the doors were sort of like kicked open for hip hop. It became a growing burgeoning phenomenon in sound, like sonically, but then also culturally. Because this is the thing that was really sort of meaningful, but I wasn't able to articulate it at the time because at the time I don't know, I was probably about 8, 9 years old. Um, but what hip hop did was it took every art form that would be considered, let's call it traditional white Western European art form, like the voice, which would be opera traditionally, the sound, which would be orchestral music traditionally, or some kind of instrumentation. The dance part, which could be considered, ballet or jazz or tap or whatever. And then the visual, which was graffiti, but
Mm.
historically it would be like the visual arts that you would go into an art museum to experience. None of those things were accessible for many people in the minority community, particularly in the Bronx where hip hop was created. So the hip hop pioneers, they were brilliant in bringing the accessibility of all of those historical art forms to the people in the hood, right? To the black and brown kids or people who had, on the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum and had shared values. So, they would they opened it up and allowed for that experience to the arts to be at the fingertips of those folks. And you didn't have to have a lot of money. You didn't have to go to, lessons that your family probably couldn't afford. And you didn't have to dress up for it. It was just this is art and it should be accessible to you. And that's what it was appealing to me and my friends, particularly when you start talking about hip hop dance and breakdancing. And that was like, we would just get old refrigerator boxes and practice out breakdance moves in the parking lot, right? So all of it was really super accessible. And because of that accessibility, it embedded itself in the minds and the hearts of the people who began to love it really, really sincerely. And so, that's how I got into hip hop. And so because of that love of hip hop, you fast forward to 2021, where I became the executive director of Elementz. It was for me, it was a no brainer. At the time, I was working at Arts Wave, which is the region's largest art funder, and as a vice president of Impact at Arts Wave. And but also at the time, COVID had hit, right? COVID was really pervasive, and I was at a vitamin store trying to get some echinacea, and I got a call. I got a call from a friend of mine who was on the Elementz board. He said, "I want you to consider something. We're doing a succession strategy, and I think that you'd be great for leading the organization into what it could be." And I said, "Yes." Without even thinking, I said, yes, that's something I definitely want to do. And it actually took a year. The interview process took a year because of COVID. But then finally, in December of 2020, it was made an offer, and by February of 2021, I was at the center where I am now.
Elements teaches programs around DJing, emceeing, music production,
Hmm.
poetry, and
Yep.
dance,
Yep.
all kind of performance-based
Hmm.
mediums, maybe not music production, but for the most part, it's all performance-based. Do you feel like performing is kind of a superpower?
That's an interesting question. Um, I'm not entirely certain that I would identify it as a superpower. It's a skill that, if appreciated and practiced, and there's a level of dedication to it, it raises the capacity of the performer. And I say that really carefully because there is although hip hop is accessible, it's important that there's a clear understanding that there is a barrier of entry for hip hop, and that barrier of entry is that you actually have to love the culture and you actually have to be dope. That's it, right? And there are a lot of people who, historically who have been considered culture vultures or people who really exploit the culture.
Mm.
And it becomes really evident that those people didn't dedicate themselves to the culture, and the lack of dopeness shines true. It becomes very evident. So I don't know that it's a superpower as much as it is like, people who love the culture appreciate it so much that they want to hone their craft,
Mm.
right? And that just takes commitment and dedication.
Yeah. On the website, it says that advancing authentic hip hop
Yeah.
culture is a critical
Hmm.
aspect of the mission.
Yeah.
And I think the average American may perceive hip hop very differently from like what they see in the mainstream. And
Yep.
speaking, of people who have exploited the culture, what's the difference between rap and hip hop?
Good question. Rapping is something you do. Hip hop is something you live.
Mm.
Rapping it's an action. It's a piece of the art form. It's not the whole of the art form. And what people in the mainstream media tend to do is they cherry pick the most transient part of an art form, the one that's most transferable. And the voice is the easiest thing to transfer. You can't. It's hard to transfer an entire culture and do it right. So they just take bits and pieces of it. And so, over the course of hip hop history, it's been really easy to just focus on the rappers. However, in the very beginning of hip hop would not have started without the DJs.
Mm.
The DJs were actually the bedrock of the culture. In fact, in 1973, a guy named Clive Campbell, who is better known as DJ Kool Herc, he was credited as with starting the first having the first hip hop party, which actually, coincidentally was a back to school party that he was throwing for his little sister at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. And, as a DJ, he would set the tone for the party, right? And make sure that the people were dancing and doing very creative and innovative things with music, with turntables, understanding, the power of music and how that can be inspirational and motivational and get the serotonin flowing and all that sort of stuff. And so all that was part of his mad science, mad scientist approach and keeping the party going. In fact, he was credited with something that he called the merry-go-round, which was basically taking two of the same record, and finding in that record the breakbeat or the breakdown part of the song, and basically looping that breakbeat, transferring it from one record to the next record to extend the breakbeat. And when you extended the breakbeat, it gave people who were at the party a longer period of time to dance. And so dancing longer on the breakbeat developed or birthed the break dancers. And that was the inception of breakdancing. And so that is the critical cornerstone of hip hop. And then after a period of time, you got people who wanted to like say something while the music was playing. And that was the birth of the MC, but the MC was secondary to the DJ. And so, the what happens now though, in on radio and in media, it's just easier to identify a personality, right?
Mhm.
Someone who has charisma, someone who has command of language, and this is not at all to discount MCs because there are some really great MCs. But what it does when you try to disconnect a piece from the whole is it gives you a greater opportunity to exploit it. And so then when you have like no record is distributed by the artists themselves, right? There's always a record company or some lawyers or some people behind the scenes who are, who have an individual capitalistic agenda, and they're trying to make money, right? And so that's where the exploitation comes in, and it's really easy to identify what's most exploitable and would increase music sales. And in most instances, it's something that's going to be controversial. And in recent history, it's the controversy has been like death and destruction and those kinds of things, much like you would see in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or like those action movies. Somebody's got like a John Wick movie. You're killing 100 people in 15 minutes. The same can be said for hip hop, for rapping, not hip hop, but for rapping. But there was a period of time in the 80s and the 90s and perhaps even the late 90s, a little bit of the early 2000s, where hip hop artists, and again, this is different from rappers, hip hop artists who happen to rap were focused on content that was uplifting,
Mhm.
right? And the identification of Africa, the culture of the African diaspora. You would see, like, if you ever did any research on it, you would see like major hip hop artists like Queen Latifah or Heavy D or Big Daddy Kane or Rakim. These were all artists who would wear African medallions or kente cloth prints, or they would wear sweatshirts and hats of historically black colleges and universities, really sort of uplifting the positive aspects of culture of the black culture. But then at a certain point, that became it was easier to exploit it by the folks who were behind the scenes. And that's where rapping became like really more important than the culture itself. So it's really important for me and us at Elements to make sure that there's a clear distinction, or at the very least, not a clear distinction, but at the very least that there's a clear understanding about the culture itself. And we don't do, we don't try to discount what young people may like. That's not the goal. The goal is to inform and inspire, right? But the information part of it becomes critical. And I guess that's probably where my background as a teacher comes into play. It's really important for me to provide historical context for what the art form was at a certain point and what it can be, and because all art forms go through cycles. And so, so that there can always be an anchor to, what is culturally real and culturally important, and that we never lose sight of that.
When I was a kid, a lot of the early hip hop that I was exposed to, MTV was the only place to find music when I was a kid. There was
Mhm,
no internet, no Shazam and
mhm,
stuff. And the
mhm,
DJs were always right there as the main title, like DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. He was the first guy. And Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock,
mhm,
those it was all very positive, almost cartoonish in the
mhm,
fun and the play
mhm,
and especially like Digital Underground and stuff. It
mhm,
was there was nothing about it that alienated me as um, as a white person, as a
mhm.
woman. It was all very inclusive,
Mhm.
and Run DMC too.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
it was all really great. It was all really great, inclusive, high vibe stuff. And then, when
Mhm,
I got to junior high, all of a sudden it was like Easy E and Straight Outta Compton. NWA,
Mhm.
and he couldn't listen to it anymore.
Yeah, yeah, and it's important to know. This is one of the reasons why I didn't want to make a distinction. Is it's important to know that historically, because of the necessary cycle, those groups are seminal groups. NWA is an important group in hip hop history, as much as Public Enemy would be an important group in hip hop history. Public Enemy being a group that really attacked the let's call it the patriarchal establishment, um, from a political standpoint. Very important as a rap group. NWA was not as broad and as broad in their approach, but more local. So it's almost like as rap groups, Public Enemy was like addressing the federal government, where NWA was addressing your local politics,
Hmm.
right? And giving voice to the people in the hood who were saying, we can't talk to the president, but we can talk to the police, and we don't like them, so F them. You know what I mean? And because they're killing us. So it was just as important, but they were using language that was completely controversial. And some may even say avant-garde, right? It was completely different from what anybody had ever expected. Um, but the problem with it for me was not that they were saying it, but what it was that people behind the scenes they began to inspire the destruction of the black community. Because
Hmm.
it's one thing to say F the police. It's another thing entirely to say I want to kill my neighbor. You know what I mean? To promote, so that's a completely different thing, right? If you
Yeah.
and both of those statements came from that group, but what was more promoted was the messages around killing your neighbor. That F the Police song was just one song. It was just one song. The rest of the album and subsequent albums were, it was really encouraged to talk about the death and destruction of the people who looked like you on a local level. And then, it became pretty evident that that was the plan. And so then you had people like Ice Cube leave the group for those very reasons,
Hmm.
right? And then he began to be, supported by Public Enemy and people who were looking at it from a broader political spectrum. And so then you had these inner controversies that were happening where you had folks who wanted to exploit the culture, and then you had folks inside the culture who were saying, no, 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 we're missing the mark here. Um, which led to diverse offerings. Some of the content was extremely rich. Some of it remained controversial. Then it sparked the careers of many, let's call them complicated figures. Like from Digital Underground came Tupac Shakur,
Yeah.
uh, one of the greatest hip hop icons of all time, but also his approach was somewhat bipolar. It was him being able to talk about his mother in a very sensitive and loving way, or talk about teen pregnancy and in a song called like a song like Brenda's Got a Baby, like really talking about the tragedies that exist there, but then also like at the very next breath, talking about killing his neighbor and beating up someone and like all that. So it was like what was troubling was like he was the representation of the complexity of the human condition, particularly for Black men in America. So there was nothing inaccurate about it. It was just the fact that it was being magnified, right? He wasn't able to do that like I was able to do it in the privacy of my own home because I had those very same feelings, you know. But I was able to do it in the privacy of my own home, and I wasn't on being interviewed and stopped by the police and all this kind of stuff. So that's the part that became exploited. It's like he's still a human being. He's still outside of being a public figure. He still has the right to be confused and feel a particular way today, and have those feelings be changed tomorrow. That's the advantage of being human. But I think the exploitation also pigeonholed him. It was like you're either going to be this or you're going to be that. You can't be anything else. And that's just, it was unfair. And that's what happened to hip hop. It was like, you can't be as complex as rock and roll, or you can't be as complex as country music, or you can't be as complex as, orchestral music. You have to be this or you have to be that. And I think what hip hop has been saying for quite a long time is hip hop is an art form that is the expression of people, and those people are complex.
Mhm.
So allow them to be complex. And so it's coming up on the 50th anniversary of hip hop next year. It's like we're still having this conversation, we're still having this fight, but it's a necessary fight. And us at Elements, here at Elements, we're basically saying, we're going to protect, we're going to preserve, and we're going to advance hip hop as culture, as art, and as a global economic and creative force. And it won't be monolithic. It won't be this or that. It will be, an expression of the complexity of the people who make it, which are dancers and visual artists and music producers and DJs and everybody who loves the culture, and then those individuals who are committed to making dope art. So that's what I think is really important to understand about hip hop and the work that we're doing here in Elements. Is like this is no different really than you know than the evolution of Picasso, because Picasso started off as a figurative artist, and then over the course of his career, he was able to evolve to a cubist painter, right? And that evolution was allowed, and my whole flag in the ground for hip hop is allow for it to be, what it is, full stop. Allow for it to be what it is, what it's going to be, because as the elders would say, being can always be corrected by becoming, right?
Mhm.
Whatever you are in the present can, if it's wrong, it can always be corrected by what you plan to become. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to move, clear the ground, or clear the way, so it can evolve into whatever iteration it's going to grow into.
Wow. What an educational talk. Thank you for all the great info. I have one last
No,
question for you.
sure.
What was the event that happened in 1973 that birthed hip hop?
That was the Cool Herc event. Prior to that, the New York City was in economic upheaval, right? It was in complete disarray, and places like the Bronx was literally burning. And you had people who owned the tenement buildings in the Bronx, and they were burning those buildings down so that they can collect insurance money. And at the same time, the people who live in those buildings were displaced, but not displaced to someplace else. They just didn't have like safe homes. They were housing insecure. Some of them were still living in those burned down buildings. Some of the kids were playing in like parking lots that had demolished buildings and broken glass and busted out car windows and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, you had people who were immigrants from places like the West Indies and Jamaica and Haiti, and other places in the African diaspora who settled in at least actually all of the five boroughs in New York. While all of this is going on, although in August 11th of '73, that is the date that Kool Herc threw the back to school party for his little sister. That is that's the event that is historically identified as the birth of hip hop. Prior to that, you actually had other DJs in Brooklyn and in other boroughs actually embracing the tenets of hip hop before that time period. You had guys who would adopt DJ monikers, really elaborate DJ monikers. There's a guy named Grandmaster Flowers and this is well before 1973. This is like in the 68, 69. from Brooklyn, and these guys were, experimenting with really elaborate technologies that didn't exist prior to that. They were like remaking speakers so they can get the richest sonic sound. But in '73, on August 11th, that's when Clive Campbell, DJ Kool Herc, threw that party, and that was the spark that sort of lit the fuse for hip hop to really begin to catapult itself. And it wasn't really a huge explosion. It was like a door kicked open. It's like, okay, now we got something that we can really hone and have ourselves. And then, you have people like Grandmaster Flash come in and, use his mad scientist DJ skills to create other forms of DJing and really sort of encouraging the people to look at the conditions of the city that they were in and still celebrate the love and community that they have for one another in spite of, right? This is one of the reasons why I believe like the people who come from very difficult circumstances, I believe that they're alchemists because they're individuals who can, they can take just dust and turn it into gold. And I believe that those early hip hop pioneers, they were alchemists. They did that very thing.
Mm. What a beautiful way to end our talk about hip hop and hip hop culture. Damian, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Love it.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Damian Hoskins is a member of the board at the Art Academy. He's also executive director at Elementz, whose Creative Futures initiative is one of many programs exposing young people of color to all of the opportunities available to them in the creative workforce. For more information, go to elementz.org. This has been Making Art on Air. I'm Morgan Grace.